Every morning at dawn, Alexia Bennet arranged her modest collection of flowers in the same weathered basket, claiming the same corner of Covent Garden where the cobblestones had worn smooth beneath countless footsteps of London's forgotten souls. At 23, she had perfected the art of invisibility, head down, voice soft, existing in the spaces between the hurried steps of those who mattered. Her calloused hands spoke of years spent coaxing beauty from stems and petals, while her patched dress and worn shawl marked her as one of society's expendables. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that would never acknowledge her existence. Until the morning when Alexander Rowley, the Duke of Ashford, stopped. Not for her flowers. Dukes didn't buy posies from street vendors, but because something in her quiet dignity caught his attention like sunlight through stained glass. When she offered him a simple bunch of violets without the fawning reverence he'd grown to expect, speaking to him as if he were merely a man rather than a title, she unknowingly shattered the careful walls he'd built around his heart. What began as a moment's curiosity would become a love story that defied every rule of their rigid society, challenged the very foundations of class and privilege, and proved that the most profound connections bloom in the most impossible soil. Their love would scandalize the ton, threaten ancient bloodlines, and force them both to choose between the safety of convention and the bells of St. Paul's. Covent Garden had just finished chiming 6 o'clock when Alexia Bennet arranged the last of her flowers in the wicker basket that had belonged to her mother, and her mother's mother before that. The morning mist still clung to the cobblestones of the square, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread from the nearby bakeries and the earthy sweetness of the blooms she tended with such careful devotion. At 23, Alexia had been selling flowers in this same corner for nearly 8 years, ever since consumption had claimed her mother and left her entirely alone in the world. She knew every crack in the pavement, every shift in the morning light, every face that passed by her modest display. Most importantly, she knew her place in the invisible hierarchy of London's streets, somewhere between the crossing sweepers and the match girls, existing in the shadows cast by those who mattered. "Morning, Alexia," called Tom Fletcher, the baker's apprentice, as he hurried past with a tray of fresh rolls balanced on his head. "Got any of those yellow ones today, Mrs. Hartwell said she might stop by for her usual." "Daffodils are just coming into season," Alexia replied with a smile that transformed her tired face into something approaching beauty. "Tell Mrs. Hartwell I've set aside the best ones for her." It was true. She had. Mrs. Hartwell, the widow who ran the haberdashery on King Street, was one of her few regular customers who treated her with genuine kindness rather than the grudging tolerance most showed to street vendors. For customers like her, Alexia would save the finest blooms, even if it meant selling the inferior ones to herself. As the morning progressed, and the square filled with the usual bustle of market day, Alexia fell into the familiar rhythm of her trade. A bunch of primroses for the young maid who worked in one of the grand houses on Bedford Street, carefully counted coins exchanged with shy smiles. A single red rose for the clerk who was courting the seamstress from Henrietta Street, his weekly gesture of devotion that Alexia found both touching and enviable. A small posy of mixed flowers for the cook from the Savoy Hotel, who always insisted on having something cheerful for the kitchen windowsill. These small transactions were the threads that wove together her days, each one a brief moment of human connection in a life that was otherwise marked by solitude. Alexia had learned to find satisfaction in these fleeting interactions, to take pride in the beauty she brought to others' lives, even if her own remained stubbornly grey. It was just past 10 o'clock when she noticed the commotion at the far end of the square. A magnificent carriage, all gleaming black lacquer and gold trim, had drawn up near the entrance to the Royal Opera House. Even from her distant corner, Alexia could see the elaborate coat of arms emblazoned on the door, a duke's carriage without question. She watched with idle curiosity as liveried footmen sprang into action and a tall figure in an impeccably tailored coat emerged from the vehicle. Alexander Rowley, the Duke of Ashford, stepped onto the cobblestones with the unconscious grace of a man born to command attention. At 31, he possessed the kind of aristocratic bearing that made lesser mortals step aside without thinking, combined with dark hair that caught the morning light and grey eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. His coat was cut by the finest tailors on Savile Row, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and every detail of his appearance spoke of wealth and privilege beyond most people's comprehension. Alexia had seen his type before, the great lords and ladies who occasionally passed through Covent Garden on their way to more important destinations. They moved through her world like ships through water, creating barely a ripple before disappearing again into their rarefied atmosphere. She had learned long ago not to stare, not to hope for acknowledgement, not to expect anything beyond the occasional dropped coin if she was fortunate enough to catch their attention. But today, something was different. The Duke had paused near the center of the square, his attention apparently caught by something in the morning bustle. His secretary, a nervous-looking man in a brown coat, was speaking rapidly and gesturing toward the opera house, but the Duke's gaze had wandered elsewhere. Alexia followed his line of sight and realized with a start that he was looking directly at her. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded square. Alexia felt her breath catch, certain that she had somehow transgressed by meeting his gaze, but unable to look away. There was something in his expression, not the cold dismissal she expected, but a kind of curious intensity that made her heart race. Then the moment passed. The Duke's secretary tugged at his sleeve, drawing his attention back to whatever urgent business had brought them to Covent Garden, and the spell was broken. Alexia quickly busied herself with rearranging her flowers, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at her own boldness. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice the approach of polished boots on cobblestones until a shadow fell across her basket. "Good morning," said a voice that was unmistakably cultured, unmistakably aristocratic, and unmistakably addressing her. Alexia looked up, and her world tilted on its axis. The Duke of Ashford stood before her modest flower stall, his grey eyes fixed on her face with the same curious intensity she had glimpsed from across the square. Up close he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that seemed to command the very air around him. Yet there was something in his expression that wasn't quite what she had expected from one of his rank. "Your Grace," she managed, scrambling to her feet and attempting a curtsy that was made awkward by her surprise and the confines of her small space. "Please don't," he said quickly, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "I didn't mean to startle you. I was simply curious about your flowers." Alexia blinked, certain she had misheard. A duke, curious about her flowers. They're just flowers, Your Grace. Nothing special, I'm afraid." "On the contrary," Alexander said, his gaze moving over her carefully arranged display. "They're quite beautiful. You have an artist's eye for arrangement." The compliment was so unexpected, so genuine, that Alexia felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time anyone had noticed her work? Really noticed it, rather than simply grabbing whatever was closest and thrusting coins at her. "Thank you," she said softly. That's very kind of you to say." "What are these?" Alexander asked, pointing to a small cluster of purple blooms that she had positioned at the front of her display. "Violets," Alexia replied, her nervousness beginning to ebb as she found herself on familiar ground. "They're just coming into season. Sweet-scented, and they last well if you keep them in cool water." "Violets," Alexander repeated, as if the word held some special significance. "My mother loved violets. She used to say they were the most honest of flowers, beautiful without being showy, fragrant without being overwhelming." There was something wistful in his voice that made Alexia look at him more closely. For just a moment, the ducal mask had slipped, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "She sounds like a wise woman," Alexia said gently. She was. Alexander's smile was sad but genuine. "She died when I was 15. I haven't thought about her violets in years." The admission was so personal, so unexpected from someone of his station, that Alexia felt something shift in the space between them. This wasn't the cold, distant aristocrat she had expected, but a man capable of grief, of memory, of the kind of quiet pain that flowers could somehow ease. Would you like some?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The violets, I mean, for remembrance." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and Alexia had the strange sensation that he was seeing her, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time in her life. "Yes," he said finally, "I would like that very much." Alexia selected the finest bunch from her display, choosing each stem with the same care she might have used for a royal commission. As she wrapped them in a piece of brown paper, she was acutely aware of his gaze upon her, of the way he watched her hands as they worked. "How much?" he asked when she handed him the small bouquet. "Nothing," Alexia said quickly. "For remembrance of your mother." "Please." Alexander stared at her, and she could see something like surprise flicker across his features. "That's very generous of you, but I couldn't possibly accept them without payment." "You could," Alexia said with a small smile, "if you wanted to. Sometimes the most valuable things can't be bought with money." The words hung in the air between them, more profound than Alexia had intended. She saw something change in Alexander's expression, a kind of recognition that made her heart skip. "Your Grace!" The sharp voice of his secretary cut through the moment like a blade. "We really must be going. The meeting with the Opera House board—" Yes, I'm coming," Alexander said, but his eyes remained fixed on Alexia's face. "Thank you," he said quietly, holding up the violets. "For these, and for the reminder." "You're welcome, Your Grace." As he turned to leave, Alexander paused and looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Alexia," she said, surprised by the question. "Alexia Bennet." "Alexia," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "A beautiful name." And then he was gone, swept away by his secretary and the demands of his position, leaving Alexia standing among her flowers, with her heart racing and her mind reeling from the impossibility of what had just occurred. The Duke of Ashford had stopped at her flower stall. He had spoken to her as if she were a person worthy of conversation, had accepted her gift with genuine gratitude, had asked her name as if it mattered. It was the stuff of fairy tales, the kind of impossible encounter that happened only in the novels she sometimes borrowed from the lending library when she could spare the pennies. "Well, I never," said Mrs. Hartwell, appearing at Alexia's elbow with her usual shopping basket. "Was that the Duke of Ashford speaking to you?" "Yes," Alexia said faintly. He bought some violets." "Bought violets? From a street flower seller?" Mrs. Hartwell's eyes were wide with amazement. "My dear girl, do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? Dukes don't buy flowers from the likes of us. They have gardens full of flowers, hothouses, professional florists at their beck and call." "I know," Alexia said quietly. "I don't understand it either." "Mark my words, child," Mrs. Hartwell said, selecting her usual bunch of daffodils. "There's more to this than meets the eye. Men like that don't do anything without a reason." As the day wore on and the normal rhythm of the market resumed, Alexia found herself replaying every moment of the encounter. The way he had looked at her, really looked at her, as if she were someone worth seeing. The gentleness in his voice when he spoke of his mother. The surprise in his eyes when she had offered him the violets without payment. Most of all, she remembered the way he had said her name, Alexia, as if it were something precious rather than the common name of a common flower seller. She told herself it meant nothing, that it was simply a moment's kindness from a man who had been reminded of his mother. Dukes didn't form attachments to street vendors. They lived in a different world entirely, one of grand estates and ancient titles and marriages arranged for political advantage. But as she packed up her remaining flowers at the end of the day, Alexia couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the brief encounter had shifted something fundamental in the careful order of her world. She had no way of knowing that across London, in the magnificent library of Ashford House, Alexander Rowley sat staring at a small bunch of violets in a crystal vase, remembering not just his mother's love for the humble flowers, but the face of the young woman who had given them to him with such quiet grace. For the first time in years, the Duke of Ashford found himself thinking about something other than duty, responsibility, and the endless demands of his position. He was thinking about amber eyes and calloused hands, and a voice that had spoken to him as if he were simply a man rather than a title. He was thinking about Alexia Bennet, and wondering when he might have reason to pass through Covent Garden again. The return. 3 days passed before Alexander found an excuse to return to Covent Garden. 3 days during which he attended tedious meetings with his estate managers, endured a dinner party where he was seated next to Lady Pemberton's vapid daughter and tried to concentrate on the stack of parliamentary papers that required his attention. But through it all, his thoughts kept drifting to a pair of amber eyes and the memory of violets offered without expectation of reward. On Thursday morning, he dismissed his carriage 2 streets away from the market and walked the remaining distance, telling himself that he needed the exercise and the fresh air. It had nothing to do with wanting to approach Alexia's flower stall without the pomp and ceremony that his usual mode of transport would announce. The square was bustling with its usual morning activity when he arrived. Vendors called out their wares, housekeepers haggled over prices, and children darted between the stalls with the fearless energy of youth. Alexander paused at the edge of the square, scanning the familiar chaos until his eyes found what they were seeking. Alexia was there, in her usual corner, arranging a fresh display of spring flowers with the same careful attention he remembered. She wore a different dress today, still patched and faded, but clean and neat, and her dark hair was pinned back in a simple style that revealed the graceful line of her neck. As he watched, she looked up to serve a customer, and her face lit with the same warm smile that had stayed with him for 3 days. Alexander found himself hesitating, suddenly uncertain of his purpose. What was he doing here? What possible reason could he give for returning to a flower stall in Covent Garden? He was the Duke of Ashford, one of the most powerful men in England. He had estates to manage, a seat in the House of Lords, responsibilities that affected thousands of people. He had no business lingering in market squares, no matter how compelling he found the flower seller who worked there. But even as these rational thoughts crowded his mind, his feet were carrying him across the cobblestones toward her corner of the square. "Good morning," he said, and watched as Alexia looked up from her flowers with surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "Your Grace," she said, rising from her crouch beside the flower baskets. I didn't expect to see you again." "I was in the area," Alexander said, which was technically true, though he had made sure to be in the area for this specific purpose. "I wanted to thank you again for the violets. They've brought me a great deal of pleasure." Alexia's smile was radiant. "I'm so glad. Are they holding up well?" "Beautifully. You were right about keeping them in cool water." Alexander paused, then added, "I've placed them in my library, where I can see them while I work. They remind me that there's beauty in the world beyond account books and parliamentary reports." The admission was more personal than he had intended, but something about Alexia's presence seemed to draw honesty from him. She had a way of listening that made him want to share thoughts he normally kept carefully guarded. "That's a lovely sentiment," Alexia said softly. "I've always believed that flowers have a way of making even the most ordinary spaces feel special." "Is that why you chose this work?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. "Bringing beauty to ordinary spaces?" Alexia's expression grew thoughtful. "I suppose it is, in part. But mostly it was necessity. My mother died when I was 15, and I had to find a way to support myself. She had taught me about flowers, how to care for them, how to arrange them. It seemed natural to turn that knowledge into a livelihood." "You've been doing this for 8 years?" Alexander asked, struck by the realization that she had been entirely on her own since an age when most young ladies of his acquaintance were still in the schoolroom. 8 years this autumn," Alexia confirmed. "It's not an easy life, but it's honest work, and I take pride in it." There was no self-pity in her voice, no resentment at the circumstances that had forced her into such a precarious existence. Alexander found himself admiring her resilience, her dignity in the face of hardship that would have broken many people. "You should take pride in it," he said earnestly. "What you do brings joy to people's lives. That's more than can be said for many occupations." "Even more than being a duke?" Alexia asked with a teasing smile that transformed her entire face. Alexander laughed, surprised by her boldness and charmed by it in equal measure. "Especially more than being a duke. Most of what I do involves sitting through interminable meetings and signing papers. Not nearly as rewarding as creating beauty. But surely your position allows you to do good in the world, to help people to make changes that matter." "In theory, yes. In practice..." Alexander trailed off, realizing that he was about to voice criticisms of the aristocratic system that he had never spoken aloud before. "In practice, change comes very slowly to people in my position. We're rather set in our ways." "But you're not set in your ways," Alexia observed. "You're here, talking to a flower seller as if she were your equal. That suggests a willingness to see beyond convention." Her words hit him with unexpected force. She was right. He was here, engaging in conversation with a woman so far beneath his social station that their interaction would be scandalous if any one of his acquaintance witnessed it. Yet it felt more natural, more genuine than any conversation he had had in months. "Perhaps you bring out the unconventional in me," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, charged with implications that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Alexia's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at her flowers, suddenly shy. "Your Grace, Alexander," he said impulsively. "My name is Alexander. I would be honored if you would use it." Alexia's eyes widened with shock. "I couldn't possibly. It wouldn't be proper." "Proper according to whom?" Alexander asked. "We're two people having a conversation. Why should arbitrary rules of address matter more than simple human connection?" "Because you're a duke, and I'm..." Alexia gestured helplessly at her modest surroundings, her worn dress, her calloused hands. "You're a remarkable woman who has built a life for herself through courage and determination," Alexander finished firmly. "You're someone who sees beauty in simple things and shares it with others. You're someone who speaks honestly and without artifice. Those qualities matter far more than titles or birth." Alexia stared at him, and Alexander could see the conflict in her amber eyes, the desire to believe his words warring with a lifetime of knowing her place in the world's hierarchy. "I don't understand why you're saying these things," she said finally. "Why you're here at all. Men like you don't, people of your station don't what? Don't notice people like me. Don't speak to us as if we matter." The quiet pain in her voice cut through Alexander like a blade. How many times, he wondered, had she been dismissed, ignored, treated as if she were invisible? How many people had looked through her rather than at her, seeing only her circumstances rather than her character? "Then they're fools," he said with quiet intensity, "because you do matter, Alexia. You matter very much." Before she could respond, a commotion at the far end of the square caught their attention. A group of well-dressed ladies had emerged from a carriage and were making their way through the market, their elaborate bonnets and silk gowns marking them as members of the ton. Alexander recognized them immediately, Lady Worthington and her daughters, accompanied by the notorious gossip Mrs. Pemberton. "Your Grace," Lady Worthington's voice carried clearly across the square as she spotted him. "What a delightful surprise. Whatever brings you to Covent Garden at this hour?" Alexander felt Alexia stiffen beside him, saw her take an instinctive step backward, as if trying to disappear into the shadows. The contrast between her reaction and the lady's bold approach to him was stark and telling. "Lady Worthington," he replied with the polite coolness that was his usual defense against unwanted social encounters. "I was conducting some business in the area." "Business? In the market?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes were sharp with curiosity as she took in the scene. Alexander standing before a flower stall, Alexia hovering uncertainly nearby. "I was purchasing flowers," Alexander said calmly, and before he could think better of it, he turned to Alexia. "Miss Bennet, I'll take those roses, if you please." The use of her name, the acknowledgement of her as a person rather than a mere vendor, sent a ripple of shock through the watching ladies. Alexia, to her credit, recovered quickly from her surprise and selected a beautiful bunch of pink roses, wrapping them with hands that trembled only slightly. "How much?" Alexander asked. "2 shillings, Your Grace," Alexia said quietly. Alexander handed her a sovereign, far more than the flowers were worth, and when she started to protest, he shook his head slightly. "For the excellent service," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it clear the transaction was not open for discussion. "Thank you, Your Grace," Alexia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good day, Miss Bennet," Alexander said formally, but his eyes held a warmth that was meant for her alone. As he turned to escort the ladies away from the flower stall, Alexander caught a glimpse of Alexia's face. She looked stunned, overwhelmed, and something else. Grateful, perhaps, that he had not pretended not to know her when confronted with his own social circle. "Miss Bennet?" Lady Worthington's voice was sharp with curiosity. "You know the flower seller's name?" "I make it a point to know the names of people who provide me with excellent service," Alexander replied smoothly. "It's simple courtesy." But even as he deflected their questions and allowed himself to be drawn into their chatter about the latest social events, Alexander's thoughts remained with the young woman he had left behind. He could still see the surprise in her eyes when he had used her name in front of the ladies, the way she had straightened her shoulders as if drawing strength from his acknowledgement. He had crossed a line today, he realized, by speaking her name in front of members of the ton, by treating her as a person worthy of courtesy and consideration. He had made a statement that would not go unnoticed. Lady Worthington and Mrs. Pemberton were 2 of London's most dedicated gossips. By tomorrow, half the ton would know that the Duke of Ashford had been seen conducting an unusually familiar conversation with a flower seller in Covent Garden. The rational part of his mind told him he should be concerned about the potential scandal, about the damage to his reputation and the questions that would inevitably follow. But as he made his polite excuses and escaped from the ladies' company, Alexander found that he didn't care about the gossip or the speculation. For the first time in his adult life, he had acted purely on impulse, following his heart rather than the dictates of duty and propriety. And despite the potential consequences, it felt like the most honest thing he had done in years. That evening, As he sat in his library with Alexia's roses in a place of honor beside the violets she had given him, Alexander found himself planning his next visit to Covent Garden. He told himself it was simply to ensure that his public acknowledgement of her hadn't caused her any difficulties with other customers or vendors, but deep down, he knew the truth. He was planning to return because he couldn't stay away, because something about Alexia Bennet had captured his imagination and his heart in a way that no one ever had before. The Duke of Ashford was falling in love with a flower seller, and for the first time in his carefully ordered life, he didn't care who knew it. The scandal begins. The gossip reached Alexander's ears before he had even finished his morning coffee. His butler, Whitmore, delivered the news along with the morning papers, his usually impassive face showing the slightest hint of concern. "Your Grace," Whitmore said carefully, "there appears to be some discussion in certain circles regarding your recent activities in Covent Garden." Alexander set down his cup with deliberate calm. "What sort of discussion?" "Lady Worthington has been rather vocal about your familiarity with a certain flower vendor. Mrs. Pemberton has been equally forthcoming with her observations. The general consensus seems to be that your behavior was unusual." "Unusual," Alexander repeated. "For speaking politely to someone who provides a service? For knowing her name, Your Grace? And for the warmth of your interaction? Such familiarity with someone of her station is being interpreted as significant." Alexander felt a surge of anger, not at Whitmore, who was simply doing his duty by keeping his master informed, but at the small-minded gossips who had nothing better to do than dissect every interaction for signs of scandal. "I see. And what conclusions are being drawn from this earth-shattering revelation that I treated a working woman with basic human courtesy?" "There is speculation about the nature of your interest in Miss Bennet," Whitmore said delicately. "Some are suggesting that she may have caught your attention in ways that go beyond her flowers." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had expected gossip, but the speed with which it had spread and the salacious nature of the speculation still caught him off guard. "Have there been any direct approaches? Letters? Visitors seeking clarification? Your cousin, Lord Pembroke, sent word that he would like to call this afternoon. He mentioned that there were matters of family reputation that required discussion." "Of course. Edward Pembroke, his father's nephew, and the most pompous bore in the entire extended family, would be the first to arrive with lectures about proper behavior and family honor." Alexander could already imagine the conversation. Stern warnings about the dangers of association with unsuitable persons, reminders of his duty to marry well and produce heirs, perhaps even threats to involve other family members if he didn't see reason. "Send word that I'll receive him at 3 o'clock, Alexander said. "And Whitmore? If anyone else comes calling with similar concerns, I'm not at home." "Very good, Your Grace." After Whitmore withdrew, Alexander sat alone with his thoughts and his growing frustration. He had known that his behavior would attract attention, but the speed and viciousness of the response still surprised him. In the space of less than 24 hours, a simple act of courtesy had been transformed into evidence of scandalous behavior. More troubling was the realization that this gossip would inevitably reach Alexia. If the ton was already buzzing with speculation about their acquaintance, it wouldn't be long before someone decided to confront her directly, to demand explanations or make accusations. The thought of her being subjected to harassment because of his actions filled him with a protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. By noon, Alexander had made his decision. He would go to Covent Garden, not to see Alexia, though he desperately wanted to, but to gauge the situation and ensure that she was not being made to suffer for his indiscretion. If necessary, he would find a way to shield her from the worst of the gossip, even if it meant enduring more speculation about his motives. The market was busier than usual when he arrived, and Alexander noticed several well-dressed individuals who seemed out of place among the usual crowd of housekeepers and servants. Curiosity seekers, no doubt, drawn by the rumors to catch a glimpse of the flower seller who had supposedly caught a duke's attention. Alexia was at her usual post, but something was different. Her posture was more rigid than usual, her smile forced as she served customers. Even from a distance, Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing around as if expecting trouble. As he watched, a fashionably dressed woman approached the flower stall, not to buy flowers, Alexander realized, but to stare. The woman made no attempt to hide her curiosity, examining Alexia from head to toe as if she were an exotic specimen in a menagerie. "So you're the one," the woman said loudly enough for nearby vendors to hear. "The flower girl who's caught the Duke of Ashford's eye. I must say, I don't see what all the fuss is about." Alexander saw Alexia's face flush with embarrassment and anger, saw her hands tremble as she tried to maintain her composure. "I'm sorry, madam," Alexia said with admirable dignity, "but if you're not interested in purchasing flowers, I have other customers to serve." "Oh, but I am interested," the woman replied with malicious amusement. "I'm interested in understanding what makes a common flower seller think she can aspire to the attention of a duke. Tell me, my dear, what tricks did you use to ensnare him?" That was enough. Alexander strode across the square with purposeful steps, his face set in the kind of expression that had been known to make hardened politicians reconsider their positions. "Madam," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the immediate area, "I believe you are mistaken about something." The woman spun around, her eyes widening as she recognized him. "Your Grace, You were just leaving," Alexander said with icy politeness. "Miss Bennet is a respectable businesswoman who deserves to conduct her trade without harassment from idle gossips. But Your Grace, surely you can see that your association with someone of her station is causing talk." "The only thing I can see," Alexander interrupted, "is a woman who has nothing better to do than torment someone who works hard for an honest living. I suggest you find a more worthy use of your time." The woman's face turned red with humiliation and anger, but she was not foolish enough to argue further with a duke. She gathered her skirts and stalked away, muttering under her breath about the declining standards of the nobility. Alexander turned to Alexia, who was staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and dismay. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Yes, thank you," Alexia said, but her voice was shaky. "You didn't have to do that. You've only made things worse for yourself." "I couldn't stand by and watch you be insulted," Alexander said firmly. "Has this been happening all morning?" Alexia nodded reluctantly. "People have been coming by to look at me, to ask questions. Some have been kind, but others—" She trailed off, but Alexander could see the hurt in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "This is my fault. I should have anticipated that people would react this way." "It's not your fault," Alexia said quickly. "You were kind to me, that's all. It's not your fault that people choose to see something scandalous in simple kindness." Her generosity in the face of harassment only made Alexander admire her more. Here was a woman who was being made to suffer because of his actions, yet she refused to blame him for the small-mindedness of others. "Nevertheless, I feel responsible," he said. "Is there anything I can do to help? Perhaps you could take a few days away from the market until the gossip dies down?" Alexia shook her head. "I can't afford to lose the income. This is my livelihood, Your Grace. I can't simply disappear because people are talking." The quiet dignity with which she faced her circumstances struck Alexander forcefully. While he had the luxury of retreating to his estate or traveling abroad until the scandal blew over, she had no such options. She would have to endure whatever came, continuing to work and support herself despite the unwanted attention. "Then I'll make sure you're not harassed further," Alexander said decisively. "I'll speak to the market authorities, ensure that troublemakers are removed quickly." "Your Grace, please," Alexia said, her voice urgent. "You're only making it worse. Every time you defend me, every time you show concern for my welfare, it feeds the gossip. People are already saying—" She stopped, biting her lip. "What are they saying?" "That I'm your mistress," Alexia said quietly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "That you've set me up in this flower stall as a cover for our association. That I'm using feminine wiles to extract money and gifts from you." Alexander felt a surge of rage at the crude assumptions being made about both of them. "Those people know nothing about you, about your character or your integrity. Their opinions are worthless." "But they're not worthless to me," Alexia said with quiet pain. "My reputation is all I have. If people believe I'm what they're saying I am, it will destroy everything I've worked for." The anguish in her voice cut through Alexander like a blade. In his world, reputation could be restored with time and the right connections. In hers, a damaged reputation could mean the difference between survival and destitution. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "Stay away. Pretend we've never met." Alexia looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander could see the conflict in her amber eyes. "I don't know," she said finally. "I only know that every time you come here, every time you show me kindness, it makes things more difficult. But I also know that I've never met anyone like you, anyone who sees me as more than just what I am." You are so much more than what you do for a living, Alexander said with quiet intensity. You're intelligent, kind, resilient, beautiful. Please don't, Alexia interrupted, glancing around nervously. People are watching, listening. Alexander followed her gaze and realized she was right. Several vendors and customers were making no attempt to hide their interest in their conversation. Every word, every gesture would be reported and embellished before the day was over. You're right, he said, stepping back slightly. I should go. But Alexia, he paused, using her name deliberately despite the watching eyes. This isn't over. I won't let gossip and small-minded prejudice dictate my actions or my feelings. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing among her flowers with her heart racing and her mind reeling from the implications of his words. That afternoon, Alexander endured the expected lecture from his cousin Edward, who arrived at Ashford House armed with moral indignation and family pride. Alexander, what in God's name are you thinking? Edward demanded almost before he had settled into his chair. The entire town is talking about your fascination with some flower seller. Do you have any idea what this is doing to the family name? I'm thinking that I'm a grown man capable of choosing my own associations, Alexander replied calmly. And I'm thinking that the family name will survive my speaking politely to a hard-working woman. Politely? Alexander, you knew her name. You defended her publicly. People are saying you've been visiting her regularly, that she's what, Edward? Your mistress, Edward said bluntly. They're saying you've set her up in that flower stall as a cover for an illicit relationship. Then they're wrong, Alexander said with quiet firmness. Miss Bennet is a respectable woman who has done nothing to deserve such speculation. Miss Bennet? You call her Miss Bennet? Alexander, she's a flower seller, a nobody. You can't possibly be considering... Edward's voice rose in horror as a new possibility occurred to him. Considering what? Marriage. Please tell me you're not considering marriage to this person. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and his silence seemed to confirm Edward's worst fears. My God, you are, Edward breathed. Alexander, you cannot be serious. You're the Duke of Ashford. You have a duty to your title, to your family, to marry someone of appropriate station and produce legitimate heirs. You cannot throw all of that away for some infatuation with a street vendor. What I can and cannot do, Alexander said with dangerous quiet, is my decision to make. Not yours, not society's, not anyone else's. But the scandal, the damage to our family's reputation. Alexander, think of what you're risking. Estates, political influence, social standing. All for what? A pretty face and a moment's fancy. Alexander's eyes flashed with anger. You know nothing about her, Edward. Nothing about her character, her intelligence, her strength. You see only her circumstances and judge her accordingly. That says far more about your limitations than hers. I see reality, Edward shot back. She's a flower seller, Alexander. She has no education, no breeding, no fortune. What could you possibly have in common with such a person? More than I've ever had in common with any of the vapid debutantes you and the rest of society would have me marry, Alexander replied sharply. Alexia Bennet has more genuine worth in her little finger than most of the ton combined. Edward stared at him in horror. You're using her Christian name. Alexander, this has gone too far. I'm going to have to speak to the other family members, perhaps even consider intervention. You will do no such thing, Alexander said, rising from his chair with the kind of ducal authority that brooked no argument. My personal affairs are exactly that, personal. I will not tolerate interference from you or anyone else. Then you leave me no choice, Edward said, also standing. I cannot stand by and watch you destroy everything our family has built. If you won't see reason, perhaps others can make you see it. After Edward's departure, Alexander sat alone in his library, staring at the roses Alexia had sold him. The threats were beginning, just as he had expected. Soon he would face pressure from every quarter. Family members, political allies, social connections. They would all unite in their determination to save him from what they saw as a disastrous infatuation. But as he looked at the flowers, remembering the grace with which Alexia had handled the morning's harassment, Alexander felt his resolve only strengthen. He had spent his entire life living according to other people's expectations, fulfilling duties imposed by birth and circumstance. For the first time, he had found someone, worth fighting for. The question was whether Alexia would be willing to fight alongside him or whether the pressure and scandal would drive her away before he could convince her that their connection was worth the cost. The choice. The next morning brought news that made Alexander's blood run cold. Whitmore delivered it along with the morning papers, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "there has been an incident at Covent Garden. Miss Bennet was apparently accosted by a group of ladies yesterday evening as she was closing her stall. The confrontation became quite heated." Alexander was on his feet before Whitmore finished speaking. "What kind of confrontation? Was she hurt?" "Physically, no, Your Grace, but according to my sources, the ladies made their opinions about her association with you quite clear. They accused her of improper behavior and suggested that she was bringing shame upon the market and the neighborhood." "Who were these ladies?" "I believe Lady Pemberton was among them, along with several of her particular friends. They seem to have appointed themselves as guardians of public morality." Alexander felt a surge of fury that threatened to overwhelm his usual self-control. The idea of Alexia being cornered and harassed by a pack of self-righteous gossips filled him with a protective rage that surprised him with its intensity. "Have the carriage prepared immediately," he ordered. "I'm going to Covent Garden." "Your Grace," Whitmore said hesitantly, "perhaps it would be wise to consider that your presence there might only inflame the situation further." Alexander paused, recognizing the wisdom in his butler's words, even as every instinct urged him to rush to Alexia's defense. His public support might indeed make things worse for her, but he couldn't simply ignore what had happened. "You're right," he said finally, "but I need to know how she is, whether she needs assistance. Send Jenkins to the market, discreetly. Have him observe the situation and report back." "Very good, Your Grace." The wait for Jenkins's return was agony. Alexander paced his library like a caged animal, unable to concentrate on anything but worry for Alexia's welfare. When the footman finally returned, his news was both relieving and troubling. "Miss Bennet is at her usual post, Your Grace," Jenkins reported. "She appears unharmed, but subdued. Business seems slower than usual, and several of the other vendors are keeping their distance." Keeping their distance. It appears that some are concerned about being associated with the controversy surrounding her. They fear it might affect their own trade, so the isolation was beginning. Alexander had seen it before. How quickly society could turn against someone who violated its unspoken rules. Alexia was being punished not for any wrongdoing, but for the crime of attracting his attention. Did she seem distressed? She maintained her composure, Your Grace, but I would say she appeared resigned, as if she were expecting further trouble. That evening, Alexander made a decision that he knew would shock his household and scandalize society even further. He would go to Alexia, not publicly, not in his ducal carriage with all its attendant ceremony, but quietly, after dark, when he could speak with her without creating more spectacle. He dismissed his valet early and dressed simply, in the kind of plain coat and breeches that would allow him to move through London streets without attracting attention. Then, as the city settled into evening quiet, he made his way on foot through the darkening streets toward Covent Garden. The market was nearly deserted at this hour, most of the vendors having packed up their wares and departed for their homes. But as Alexander approached Alexia's corner, he could see a solitary figure still there, sitting on a wooden crate beside her flower baskets. She looked up as he approached, and even in the dim light of the street lamps, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of the day's trials evident in every line of her posture. "Your Grace," she said quietly, rising from her makeshift seat. "You shouldn't be here. Not like this, not alone." "I had to come," Alexander said, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I heard about what happened yesterday evening. Are you all right?" Alexia's smile was tired but genuine. "I'm fine. It was unpleasant, but I've endured worse." "You shouldn't have to endure anything," Alexander said with quiet intensity. "This is my fault, and I'm going to find a way to fix it." "How?" Alexia asked, and there was something almost despairing in her voice. "How can you fix the fact that I'm a flower seller and you're a duke? How can you change the way society works, the way people think?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "But I know I can't simply walk away and pretend this never happened. I care about you, Alexia, more than I've ever cared about anyone." The words hung in the air between them, a confession that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Alexia stared at him, her amber eyes wide with a mixture of joy and despair. "You can't care about me," she whispered. "It's impossible. We're from different worlds, Alexander. Different species, almost. What you're feeling. It's just curiosity, fascination with something outside your usual experience. Don't tell me what I'm feeling, Alexander said, stepping closer despite the risk of being seen. I'm 31 years old, Alexia. I've had plenty of experience with curiosity and fascination. This is different. You are different. Different how? She challenged, though her voice was soft. You're real, Alexander said simply. You say what you mean, feel what you feel, without calculation or artifice. You work hard, you're kind to others, you find beauty in simple things. You've never once asked me for anything, or tried to use my position for your own advantage. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world? Tears were sliding down Alexia's cheeks now, though she made no sound. It doesn't matter how rare it is, she said. It doesn't change the facts. I can't read or write beyond the most basic level. I don't know which fork to use at a formal dinner. I've never been further than 10 miles from London. I don't know how to curtsy properly or make polite conversation about art and literature. Those things can be learned, Alexander said urgently. But what you have, your character, your integrity, your capacity for genuine feeling, those things can't be taught. They're infinitely more valuable than any social accomplishment. Not in your world, Alexia said with quiet certainty. In your world, those things matter more than anything else. And even if I could learn them, even if I could somehow transform myself into a proper lady, what about children? What about heirs to your title? Could you really ask your children to bear the shame of having a flower seller for a mother? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow, not because he hadn't considered it, but because he had, and the answer terrified him. Society would indeed punish any children born of such a union, would whisper about their mother's origins for generations to come. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't have answers to all these questions, Alexia. I only know that I can't imagine my life without you in it. But you'll have to, Alexia said with quiet finality, because this, whatever this is between us, it can't continue. Every day that passes makes things worse for both of us. You're risking everything you are, everything you've worked for, and for what? For someone who can never truly be part of your world? You could be, Alexander said desperately. If you wanted to be, if you were willing to try. Alexia shook her head sadly. I've been thinking about this for days, Alexander. Really thinking, not just dreaming. Even if I could somehow learn to fit into your world, what would happen to me? I would become a curiosity, a pet project, the Duke's charity case who was elevated beyond her station. People would never let me forget where I came from. They would watch every move I made, waiting for me to reveal my true nature, to prove that breeding will tell. I wouldn't let them treat you that way, Alexander said fiercely. You couldn't stop them, Alexia replied gently. You're powerful, but you're not all powerful. And what about your family, your political allies, your responsibilities? How long before the pressure becomes too much? Before you start to resent me for the problems I've brought into your life? Alexander wanted to deny it, to insist that he would never resent her, but the honesty that had drawn him to her in the first place prevented him from making promises he wasn't certain he could keep. So, what are you saying? He asked quietly. That we should simply give up? Pretend we never met? I'm saying that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you care about is to let them go, Alexia said, her voice breaking slightly. I'm saying that love isn't always enough to overcome the obstacles the world puts in its way. And I'm saying that I refuse to accept that, Alexander replied with sudden determination. I refuse to believe that birth and circumstance are more powerful than genuine feeling. There has to be a way, Alexia. There has to be. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the square. Both of them froze, realizing the danger of being discovered together in such circumstances. Alexander quickly stepped back into the shadows of a nearby building, while Alexia busied herself with packing up her remaining flowers. Two men in the uniform of the night watch passed by, their lanterns casting dancing shadows across the cobblestones. They nodded politely to Alexia, but paid no attention to the figure pressed against the building wall, and after what seemed like an eternity, their footsteps faded into the distance. You see, Alexia said quietly when they were gone, we can't even have a conversation without risking scandal. How could we possibly build a life together? Alexander emerged from the shadows, his face set with new resolve. By refusing to let fear dictate our choices, he said, by being brave enough to fight for what matters. And what if we lose? Alexia asked. What if we fight and sacrifice everything and still fail? Then at least we'll have tried, Alexander said. At least we'll know we didn't give up without a fight." Alexia looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander could see the war being fought in her amber eyes, hope battling with despair, love struggling against practicality. "What are you asking of me?" she said finally. "I'm asking you to trust me," Alexander said, moving closer despite the risk. "I'm asking you to believe that what we have is worth fighting for. I'm asking you to give me time to find a solution. How much time? I don't know. But I promise you this. I won't ask you to endure this uncertainty indefinitely. If I can't find a way to make this work, if I can't find a path that doesn't require you to sacrifice everything you are, then I'll step aside, I'll let you go." The promise was painful to make, but Alexander knew it was necessary. He couldn't ask Alexia to wait forever for a solution that might never come. "And in the meantime," she asked. "In the meantime, we're careful, we're discreet. We find ways to see each other that don't feed the gossip mill." Alexia was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the cobblestones at her feet. When she finally looked up, Alexander saw that she had made her decision. "All right," she said softly. "I'll trust you. I'll wait. But Alexander, if this becomes too much, if the cost becomes too high for either of us, we have to be honest about it. We have to be willing to let go." "Agreed," Alexander said, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. As they parted that night, Alexia to her modest lodgings above a bakery, Alexander to his grand mansion in Mayfair, both carried with them the weight of an impossible situation and the fragile hope that love might somehow find a way to triumph over the rigid barriers of their world. But even as Alexander walked through the quiet streets, his mind was already working on the problem, searching for solutions that seemed to exist only in fairy tales. He was a duke, with all the power and privilege that title conferred. Surely there had to be a way to use that power to protect the woman he loved. The question was whether he could find it before the pressure became too much for either of them to bear. The proposition. Alexander spent the following week in a state of restless energy, his mind constantly working on the seemingly impossible problem of how to bridge the vast social chasm that separated him from Alexia. He consulted legal documents, researched historical precedents, and even considered the radical step of renouncing his title, though he quickly realized that such an action would solve nothing and might actually make things worse for both of them. It was during a particularly frustrating afternoon of fruitless research that inspiration struck from an unexpected quarter. His secretary, Mr. A. Harrison, had brought him a stack of correspondence that included an invitation to a charity gala organized by Lady Catherine Pembroke, Edward's wife and one of London's most prominent social reformers. "The Pembroke Foundation for the Education of Working Women," Alexander read aloud, studying the elegant invitation. "How interesting." "Your Grace," Harrison inquired. "Tell me, Harrison, what do you know about this foundation? About Lady Pembroke's work?" "A great deal, actually, Your Grace. Lady Pembroke has been quite active in establishing schools and training programs for women of the working classes. She believes that education can elevate anyone, regardless of their birth circumstances. It's been quite controversial in some circles." Alexander felt the first stirrings of an idea, fragile and uncertain but potentially revolutionary. "Has she had any success with these elevation projects?" "Remarkable success, Your Grace. Several of her protégés have gone on to marry quite respectably. Clerks, shopkeepers, even a few minor gentlemen. Society has largely accepted them because Lady Pembroke's endorsement carries such weight." The idea crystallized suddenly, so clearly that Alexander wondered why he hadn't thought of it before. If Lady Pembroke could successfully elevate working women through education and social training, if society could be convinced to accept such transformations when properly presented. "Send word to Lady Pembroke that I would like to call on her tomorrow afternoon," Alexander instructed. "Tell her I'm interested in discussing a significant contribution to her foundation." "Very good, Your Grace." That evening, Alexander found himself in the unusual position of pacing his library while trying to formulate a proposition that was both audacious and practical. He was asking Lady Pembroke to take on a project that would challenge even her considerable skills, transforming a flower seller into a lady suitable for a duke's consideration. The next afternoon, he presented himself at the Pembroke residence with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Lady Catherine Pembroke received him in her elegant drawing room, her intelligent eyes bright with curiosity about his unexpected visit. "Your Grace," she said, as they settled into comfortable chairs, "I confess myself intrigued by your interest in our foundation. It's not the sort of cause that typically attracts ducal attention." Perhaps it should, Alexander replied. I've been giving considerable thought to the waste of human potential in our society, particularly among women who are denied opportunities simply because of their circumstances of birth. Lady Pembroke's eyebrows rose slightly. A surprisingly progressive view for someone of your position. Recent events have broadened my perspective, Alexander said carefully. I've come to believe that character and intelligence matter far more than birth or fortune. I couldn't agree more, Lady Pembroke said warmly. But I suspect there's more to your visit than philosophical discussion. What exactly are you proposing? Alexander took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either secure Lady Pembroke's help or convince her that he had taken leave of his senses. I want to commission your services for a very particular project, he said. I want you to take on a student, a young woman of exceptional character but humble circumstances, and transform her into someone who could move comfortably in the highest circles of society. Lady Pembroke studied him carefully. This young woman, she wouldn't happen to be a flower seller from Covent Garden, would she? Alexander's surprise must have shown on his face, because Lady Pembroke smiled knowingly. My dear Duke, the entire ton is talking about your mysterious fascination with Miss Bennet. It doesn't require great deductive powers to connect your sudden interest in social elevation with your recent romantic entanglement. It's not an entanglement, Alexander said quietly. It's love. Real, genuine love. The kind that comes perhaps once in a lifetime. The simple honesty of his admission seemed to affect Lady Pembroke deeply. Her expression softened, and she leaned forward with new interest. Tell me about her, she said gently. Not her circumstances. I can guess those. Tell me about her character, her intelligence, her potential. For the next hour, Alexander found himself describing Alexia with a passion that surprised even him. He spoke of her dignity in the face of hardship, her kindness to others despite her own struggles, her quick intelligence and natural grace. He told Lady Pembroke about their conversations, about Alexia's insights and observations, about the way she saw beauty in simple things and brought joy to others through her work. She sounds remarkable, Lady Pembroke said when he finished, but you must understand, Your Grace. What you're asking is unprecedented. I've worked with shopkeepers' daughters, seamstresses, even a few servants, but a street flower seller, the transformation required would be enormous. I know, Alexander said, and I know it's a great deal to ask. But I also know that if anyone could accomplish such a transformation, it would be you. Your reputation for working miracles is well established. Flattery, Your Grace? Truth, Alexander replied firmly. I've done my research, Lady Pembroke. I know about Miss Sarah Williams, the baker's daughter who is now married to a baronet. I know about Miss Emma Thompson, the seamstress who became a governess to the Earl of Westfield's children. You've proven that birth need not determine destiny. Lady Pembroke was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming thoughtfully against her teacup. The challenges would be immense, she said finally. Education, deportment, speech, manners, cultural knowledge, everything would need to be learned from the beginning. It would take months, possibly years. I have time, Alexander said, and I have resources. Whatever you need, tutors, materials, accommodations, cost is no object. And Miss Bennet, how does she feel about this proposed transformation? Is she willing to undergo such an intensive process? Alexander hesitated. I haven't discussed the specifics with her yet, but I believe she would be willing if she understood that it was the only way for us to have a future together. Belief is not certainty, Your Grace. This cannot be something imposed upon her. She must want it, must be committed to the process completely, or it will never succeed. I understand. Will you at least consider the proposition? Will you meet with her before making your final decision? Lady Pembroke studied him for another long moment, and Alexander could see her weighing the challenges against the potential rewards, the risks against the unprecedented nature of what he was asking. Very well, she said finally. I'll meet with Miss Bennet, but I make no promises, Your Grace. If I don't believe she has the potential for such a transformation, or if she's not fully committed to the process, I won't take on the project. I won't set either of you up for failure. That's all I ask, Alexander said, feeling a surge of hope for the first time in days. When could such a meeting be arranged? Bring her here tomorrow afternoon. I'll want to speak with her privately to assess her capabilities and her willingness. And Your Grace? Yes? You should prepare yourself for the possibility that this may not work. Love is a powerful force, but it's not always enough to overcome the practical realities of social transformation. Miss Bennet may not be willing or able to undergo such a complete change in her life. I understand, Alexander said, though privately he refused to consider failure. This had to work. It was their only chance. That evening, he made his way once again to Covent Garden, timing his arrival for the quiet hour after the market had closed, but before full darkness fell. He found Alexia in her usual spot, counting the day's earnings with the careful attention of someone for whom every penny mattered. "Alexander," she said, looking up with surprise and pleasure, "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "I have something important to discuss with you," he said, settling beside her on the wooden crate that served as her makeshift seat. "A possible solution to our situation." Alexia's eyes widened with hope and apprehension. "What kind of solution?" Alexander took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work, the strength that had carried her through so much hardship. "I've been speaking with Lady Catherine Pembroke," he began, and proceeded to explain his proposition, the possibility of education and social training that could prepare her for a life in his world. As he spoke, he watched Alexia's face carefully, seeing surprise give way to understanding, then to something that might have been fear. "You want to change me," she said when he finished. "Transform me into someone else entirely." "Not change you," Alexander said quickly. "Never change who you are, but give you the tools, the knowledge, the social skills that would allow you to move confidently in any circle." "But that's exactly what changing me means," Alexia said quietly. "Learning to speak differently, to act differently, to think differently. How much of myself would be left when the transformation was complete?" "All of it," Alexander insisted. "The essential you, your kindness, your intelligence, your strength, those things would never change. You would simply acquire the external skills necessary to navigate society." Alexia was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. "And if I refuse? If I say I'd rather remain who I am, where I am?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow, though he had been expecting it. "Then we find another way," he said, though they both knew there was no other way. "Or we accept that some obstacles are too great to overcome." "You would give up your title, your position, your entire life? For you?" "Yes, and regret it for the rest of your life," Alexia said with sad certainty. "Alexander, you were born to be a duke. It's not just what you do, it's who you are. You can't simply walk away from that without losing part of yourself." "Then what are you saying?" Alexia looked up at him, and Alexander saw tears glistening in her amber eyes. "I'm saying I'll meet with Lady Pembroke. I'll listen to what she has to say. But I won't make any promises, Alexander. This may be asking too much of both of us." "It's asking for a chance," Alexander said urgently. "A chance for us to have a future together. Isn't that worth trying for?" "I don't know," Alexia said honestly. "I truly don't know. But I'll meet with her. For you, for us, I'll at least listen." As they parted that night, both carried with them the weight of a decision that would determine not just their future together, but the very essence of who they were and who they might become. The flower seller and the Duke stood at a crossroads, and the path they chose would either lead to a love story for the ages or to the painful recognition that some barriers were simply too high to overcome. The transformation. Lady Catherine Pembroke's first meeting with Alexia Bennet took place in the elegant morning room of the Pembroke residence, away from the formal grandeur that might intimidate someone unaccustomed to aristocratic surroundings. Alexander had delivered Alexia to the house, but had not been permitted to stay. Lady Pembroke insisted on conducting her assessment without his presence, to ensure that Alexia could speak freely about her feelings and concerns. Alexia sat perched on the edge of a comfortable chair, her hands folded carefully in her lap, wearing her best dress, a simple gown of blue wool that was clean and mended but clearly marked her as someone of modest means. Despite her obvious nervousness, she maintained the quiet dignity that had first caught Alexander's attention. "Miss Bennet," Lady Pembroke began gently, "His Grace has told me a great deal about you, but I would like to hear your story in your own words. How did you come to be selling flowers in Covent Garden?" For the next hour, Alexia found herself telling her story to this elegant stranger, the death of her mother, her struggle to survive alone, her determination to maintain her independence and dignity despite her circumstances. Lady Pembroke listened without interruption, her intelligent eyes taking in not just Alexia's words, but her manner of speaking, her posture, her natural grace. "You speak very well for someone with limited formal education," Lady Pembroke observed. Your mother must have been an educated woman. She was a governess before she married my father, Alexia explained. She taught me to read and write, and she always insisted on proper speech even when times became difficult. That foundation will be invaluable, Lady Pembroke said thoughtfully. Now, Miss Bennet, I want you to be completely honest with me. His Grace has proposed a rather extraordinary undertaking, preparing you to move in the highest circles of society. What are your feelings about such a proposition? Alexia was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I'm terrified, she said finally. Terrified of failing, of disappointing him, of losing myself in the process. But I'm also hopeful. For the first time in my life, someone believes I could be more than what I am. And what do you believe? I believe I would do anything to have a future with Alexander, Alexia said with quiet conviction, even if it means becoming someone entirely different. Lady Pembroke leaned forward, her expression serious. That's exactly the wrong reason to undertake such a transformation, Miss Bennet. If you do this solely for His Grace, you will fail. You must do it for yourself, because you want to grow and learn and become everything you're capable of being. I don't understand the difference, Alexia said, confused. The difference is this. If you transform yourself only to please someone else, you will always feel like you're wearing a costume, playing a role. But if you embrace the transformation as your own choice, as your own growth, then the changes become part of who you truly are. Alexia considered this carefully. You're asking me to want this for myself, not just for him. I'm asking you to see this as an opportunity to discover your full potential, regardless of where it might lead with His Grace. Can you do that? I think so. I've always wondered what I might have been. If circumstances had been different, this would be a chance to find out. Lady Pembroke smiled for the first time since the interview began. That's a much better foundation for what we would be attempting. Now, let me be very clear about what this process would involve. It would be intensive, demanding, and at times quite difficult. You would need to live here, away from your current life, for at least 6 months. You would study for hours each day. Languages, literature, history, music, art. You would learn deportment, dancing, proper etiquette for every social situation. You would essentially be acquiring in months what most ladies of society spend years learning. And you believe it's possible? That someone like me could really learn all of that? I believe you have the intelligence and the determination to succeed if you're truly committed. But Miss Bennet, I must warn you, this process will change you. Not your essential character, but your perspective, your way of seeing the world. You may find that the person you become is quite different from the person you are now. Different how? More confident, certainly, more aware of your own worth, but also more aware of the complexities and contradictions of the world you would be entering. Society is not always kind, Miss Bennet, even to those born to it. As someone who has earned her place through transformation rather than birth, you may face challenges that others never encounter. Alexia absorbed this soberly. And if I succeed? If I become everything you believe I can become, what then? Then you will have choices you never had before. You could marry His Grace if that's what you both still want, or you could choose a different path entirely. The education and skills you acquire would open doors that are currently closed to you. You're saying I might not want to marry him anymore once I've changed. I'm saying that transformation works both ways. As you grow and change, your feelings and desires may evolve as well. You must be prepared for that possibility. The conversation continued for another hour, with Lady Pembroke explaining the practical details of the proposed program and Alexia asking thoughtful questions about what would be expected of her. Finally, Lady Pembroke sat back with a satisfied expression. Miss Bennet, I'm prepared to offer you a place in my program if you choose to accept it. I believe you have the potential to succeed, though the road will not be easy. I accept, Alexia said without hesitation. When would I begin? Immediately, if you're ready. The sooner we start, the sooner we'll know whether this extraordinary experiment can succeed. When Alexander returned that afternoon to collect Alexia, he found both women in Lady Pembroke's study, surrounded by books and papers. Alexia looked up at him with an expression he had never seen before, determined, excited, and slightly afraid. It's settled, Lady Pembroke announced. Miss Bennet will begin her studies tomorrow. I estimate it will take at least 6 months to prepare her adequately, possibly longer. 6 months, Alexander repeated, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. 6 months seemed both an eternity and no time at all. During which time, Lady Pembroke continued firmly, You will have no contact with Miss Bennet, none whatsoever. What? Alexander's voice was sharp with surprise. Why? Because she needs to focus entirely on her transformation without the distraction of your presence. And because you both need to be certain that your feelings can survive such a separation. If your attachment is merely infatuation, 6 months apart will reveal that. If it's genuine love, it will endure. Alexander looked at Alexia, seeing his own dismay reflected in her amber eyes. Alexia, do you agree to this? Lady Pembroke is right, Alexia said quietly, though her voice trembled slightly. I need to do this for myself, not just for us. And I need to know that I can become someone worthy of you, not just someone molded to please you. You're already worthy, Alexander began, but Lady Pembroke held up a hand. Your Grace, if you truly love Miss Bennet, you will respect her decision and give her the space she needs to grow. This separation is necessary for both of you. Alexander wanted to argue, to insist that such a separation was unnecessary and cruel. But looking at Alexia's face, seeing the new determination there, he realized that she had already begun to change. She was no longer the uncertain flower seller who had accepted his charity. She was a woman making her own choices, taking control of her own destiny. Very well, he said finally. 6 months. But Alexia, he moved closer to her, taking her hands in his one last time. Remember that I love you exactly as you are. Whatever changes come, that will never change. I'll remember, Alexia promised, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And Alexander, thank you for believing in me, for giving me this chance. Whatever happens, I'll always be grateful for that. As Alexander left the Pembroke residence that afternoon, walking away from the woman he loved without knowing when he would see her again, he felt as though he was stepping into an abyss. 6 months stretched before him like an eternity, filled with uncertainty and doubt. But he had given Alexia the greatest gift he could offer, the chance to discover her own worth, to become everything she was capable of being. Whether that transformation would bring them together or drive them apart remained to be seen. The next morning, Alexia Bennet began the most challenging period of her life. Under Lady Pembroke's expert guidance, she embarked on an intensive program of education and refinement that would test every limit of her intelligence and determination. She rose each day at dawn for lessons in deportment and dancing. She spent hours learning French and Italian, studying literature and history, practicing the intricate social skills that governed aristocratic society. She learned to walk with perfect posture, to curtsy with grace, to make conversation about art and music and politics. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. As weeks passed, Alexia's speech became more refined, her manners more polished, her confidence more evident. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for languages and a genuine love of learning that had been suppressed by the necessities of survival. But perhaps most importantly, she began to see herself differently. No longer the invisible flower seller who accepted whatever scraps of kindness came her way, she was becoming a woman who understood her own worth, who could hold her own in any company. Lady Pembroke watched this transformation with satisfaction and growing admiration. Alexia was proving to be an exceptional student, not just in her ability to learn, but in her determination to excel. She approached each challenge with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her life as a flower seller, but now that dignity was backed by knowledge and skill. "You're remarkable, my dear," Lady Pembroke told her one afternoon as they reviewed Alexia's progress in French conversation. "I've worked with many young women over the years, but I've never seen anyone adapt so quickly or so thoroughly." "I have good motivation," Alexia replied with a smile that was both more confident and more complex than any expression she had worn 6 months earlier. "Yes, but it's more than that. You have a natural intelligence and grace that no amount of education can create. His Grace chose well when he fell in love with you." At the mention of Alexander, Alexia's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you think he'll still love me when he sees what I've become? Do you still love him?" "Yes," Alexia said without hesitation. "But it's different now. Before, I loved him with the desperate gratitude of someone who had never been valued. Now I love him as an equal, as someone who chooses to be with him, rather than someone who needs to be with him." "That's exactly the difference that matters," Lady Pembroke said with satisfaction. "You're ready, my dear. It's time to see if His Grace is ready for the woman you've become." The blooming 6 months to the day after their separation, Alexander received a note written in elegant script that he barely recognized as Alexia's handwriting. "Your Grace, I would be honored if you would call upon me at Pembroke House this afternoon. Most respectfully, Miss A. Bennet. When he arrived, the woman who greeted him in Lady Pembroke's drawing room was both utterly familiar and completely transformed. Alexia wore an elegant gown of soft green silk that complemented her eyes perfectly. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated style that framed her face beautifully, and she moved with a grace that spoke of months of careful training. But it was her eyes that told the real story of her transformation. They held the same warmth and intelligence he remembered, but now they also held confidence, self-assurance, and the quiet strength of someone who knew her own worth. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that was perfect in its execution, yet somehow retained her natural grace. "Alexia," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're magnificent." "I'm myself," she replied with a smile that was both new and achingly familiar. "Perhaps for the first time in my life I'm truly myself." They talked for hours that afternoon, sharing the experiences of their separation, marveling at how much they had both grown during their time apart. Alexander had used the months to examine his own feelings, to ensure that his love was based on genuine connection rather than romantic fantasy. Alexia had discovered capabilities and strengths she had never known she possessed. "I have something to ask you," Alexander said as the afternoon drew to a close. "But first, I need you to know that whatever your answer, I will respect it completely." "Ask me," Alexia said, her heart racing. Alexander dropped to one knee, producing a ring that caught the afternoon light like captured starfire. "Miss Alexia Bennet, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not because I'm rescuing you, not because you need my protection, but because I cannot imagine my life without your intelligence, your strength, your love." "Yes," Alexia said, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you, as your equal, as your partner, as someone who chooses you freely and completely." Their wedding 6 months later was the social event of the season, attended by everyone who had once whispered about the impossible romance between the Duke and the flower seller. But the woman who walked down the aisle was no longer the invisible girl from Covent Garden. She was the Duchess of Ashford, a woman of intelligence, grace, and quiet strength who had earned her place through determination and courage. As they exchanged vows, Alexander and Alexia both knew that their love story had become something far greater than either had imagined. They had proven that love could indeed conquer the barriers of birth and circumstance, but only when combined with courage, determination, and the willingness to grow. The flower seller had bloomed into a duchess, but more importantly, two people had discovered that true love was not about rescue or transformation. It was about seeing and celebrating the best in each other, and having the courage to become worthy of that love. Their story became legend in London society, inspiring other impossible romances and proving that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom in the most unexpected places. From flower seller to duchess, this is the ultimate Cinderella story that proves love can bloom anywhere. When Alexia offered violets without reverence and Alexander saw her true worth, they began a journey that would defy every rule of society and transform them both. If you believe that real love sees beyond circumstances to the heart within, like this incredible transformation, don't forget to subscribe for more breathtaking historical romances that show us love isn't about rescue. It's about two people choosing to become the best versions of themselves for each other. Share in the comments. Which moment moved you most? The first meeting or the final proposal? Let's celebrate love stories that prove the most beautiful blooms come from the courage to grow.